Most people think respect is something you demand, negotiate, or perform for. They raise their voice a little higher, explain themselves a little longer, prove their point a little harder, and somehow believe that volume equals authority. But if you pay attention long enough, you'll notice a pattern. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most respected. The one constantly defending themselves is rarely the most secure. And the one who keeps announcing their worth is usually trying to convince themselves before anyone else. Real respect moves differently. It doesn't beg, it doesn't chase, it doesn't argue for space. It occupies it, quietly, deliberately, without permission. There is a kind of power that does not need to introduce itself, a kind of presence that shifts the temperature of a room without raising its tone. When that person walks in, people sit straighter, conversations recalibrate, energy adjusts. No threats were made, no speeches were delivered, yet something changed. That is silent authority. And most people never develop it because they are addicted to being seen trying. They want recognition immediately. They want validation visibly. They want reassurance externally. So they over-explain, they overshare, they overreact. And in doing so, they leak power. Because the more you show that you need something from the room, the more the room senses it. Neediness is loud even when words are soft. Insecurity is visible even when posture looks confident. The truth is uncomfortable but simple. The more you try to force respect, the further it moves away from you. Respect is not something you grab, it is something people decide to give when they feel your internal stability. And stability cannot be faked for long. The Stoics understood this long before social psychology gave it modern terminology. They did not talk about dominance, they talked about governance, self-governance, the ability to rule your reactions, your impulses, your need for approval. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire, yet in his private writings, he did not obsess over how others perceived him. He obsessed over whether he governed himself well, because he understood something most people miss. If you cannot command your inner world, you cannot command respect in the outer one. The world reads signals constantly, not your words, but your timing, not your claims, but your composure. When someone insults you and you immediately fire back, you may feel strong for a moment, but you have revealed something. You have shown that your emotions are accessible. When someone ignores you and you rush to reassert your presence, you have revealed that your attention depends on theirs. When someone questions you and you scramble to justify yourself, you have revealed that your confidence is conditional. Silent power does the opposite. It delays, it observes, it chooses. It does not rush to correct every misunderstanding. It does not panic when excluded. It does not defend every rumor. It understands that true authority is not built in the moment of conflict. It is built in the pattern of composure. And here is the shift you must make if you want to be respected without saying a word. Stop thinking of respect as something others owe you. Start thinking of it as a byproduct of how difficult you are to destabilize. Because people do not respect noise. They respect control. They respect restraint. They respect someone who cannot be easily pulled into chaos. This video is not about manipulation. It is not about intimidation. It is about something much rarer and much more powerful, becoming so internally regulated that other people feel it before you ever speak. Over the next few segments, you will learn 5 silent moves that recalibrate how people experience you. These are not tricks, they are disciplines, and if you practice them consistently, you will notice something shift. Conversations will feel different, interactions will feel lighter, disrespect will feel less frequent, not because the world changed, but because you did. If this resonates with you, understand this from the beginning. The goal is not to control others. The goal is to control yourself so completely that others adjust accordingly. And that starts with understanding the foundation beneath every silent move, inner governance before outer influence. Before you learn any silent move, you have to understand the structure beneath them, because without the right foundation, every technique becomes performance. And performance collapses under pressure. The The Stoics never aim to look powerful. They aim to be governed from within. That distinction is everything. Most people chase respect by trying to influence perception. They adjust their tone depending on who is watching. They posture when challenged. They soften when threatened. They amplify when ignored. Their behavior is reactive to the room, and the room feels that instability immediately. Epictetus drew a line that should change how you think about status forever. Some things are within your control. Most things are not. Your reactions, your judgments, your choices, your effort, those are yours. Other people's opinions, interpretations, moods, agendas, those are not. The moment you start trying to control what lives outside your jurisdiction, you become emotionally dependent on outcomes you cannot guarantee. And dependence is visible. If you need someone to validate you in order to feel secure, they hold leverage over you. If you need someone to understand you in order to feel calm, they control your emotional temperature. If you need someone to approve of you in order to feel worthy, they become the authority in your life. Respect cannot grow in that environment, because respect flows toward the person who is not bargaining for it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that he had power over his mind, not over external events. That principle is not passive, it is stabilizing. When you stop trying to engineer how people see you, you free up energy to engineer how you carry yourself. And carrying yourself well is what shifts perception naturally. There is a quiet confidence that emerges when you know exactly what belongs to you and what does not. An insult does not belong to you, it belongs to the speaker. A misunderstanding does not belong to you, it belongs to the interpretation. A rumor does not belong to you, it belongs to the insecurity that created it. When you internalize that something changes, you stop scrambling to correct every narrative. You stop over-explaining your decisions. You stop defending yourself to people who already decided how they feel about you. That restraint is not weakness, it is discipline. And discipline is attractive because it signals self-command. The paradox is simple but powerful. The less you chase respect, the more it follows. The less you seek validation, the more people assume you have it. The less you react to provocation, the more difficult you become to manipulate. This is not about indifference. It is about alignment. When your actions are aligned with your values rather than your fear of being judged, you become consistent. And consistency builds credibility. Credibility builds trust. Trust builds respect. But none of that begins externally. It begins with refusing to outsource your emotional stability. Silent power is impossible without internal order. If your thoughts are chaotic, your behavior will leak it. If your self-image is fragile, your tone will betray it. If your worth is conditional, your posture will reveal it. The Stoic path is not about suppressing emotion. It is about examining it before granting it authority. When someone disrespects you, the immediate impulse is to restore balance by reacting. But reacting is surrendering authorship. Responding is maintaining it. That space between stimulus and response is where respect is born. Because the person who pauses communicates something without speaking, I am not easily moved. And in a world addicted to immediacy, that kind of control feels rare. The 5 silent moves you are about to learn only work if they are rooted in this principle. You are not trying to dominate the room. You are trying to remain steady inside it. You are not trying to win approval. You are refusing to need it. And when you genuinely stop needing something from people, they feel it. That feeling is what recalibrates how they treat you. Respect is not volume. It is gravity. And gravity comes from mass, the mass of a mind that does not bend under every external pressure. Build that first. The moves will follow naturally. The first silent move is simple, but it separates reactive people from respected ones. Instantly control your reaction. Not suppress it. Not deny it. Control it. Most people betray their emotional state within seconds. An insult lands, and their face tightens. A disagreement surfaces, and their tone sharpens. A challenge appears, and their voice rises. They think they are defending themselves, but what they are really doing is signaling vulnerability. When someone can trigger you on demand, they have located your buttons. And once someone knows where your buttons are, they will press them whenever it benefits them. Emotional immediacy feels powerful in the moment, but it quietly hands control to whoever provoked it. Silent authority does the opposite. It delays, it breathes, it studies. When something unexpected happens, you do not rush to fill the silence. You do not rush to correct. You do not rush to retaliate. You pause. That pause is not weakness. It is calculation. It communicates that your emotions are not available for public access. It communicates that you choose when and how you engage. In social dynamics, timing is dominance. The person who reacts first often reacts from instinct. The person who reacts second often reacts from intention. Think about a situation where someone tries to undermine you in front of others. Maybe they make a subtle joke at your expense. Maybe they question your competence in a meeting. The average reaction is immediate defense. That's not true. Let me explain. You misunderstood. The more words that follow, the more the room senses tension, and tension lowers status. Now imagine something different. The comment is made. You hold eye contact for half a second longer than expected. Your expression remains neutral. No visible irritation, no forced smile, just stillness. Then, if necessary, you respond calmly, briefly, and without emotional charge. Or you let it pass entirely. That restraint unsettles insecure people because they were expecting a reaction. When they don't receive it, they lose the script they were counting on. Emotional control is intimidating because it removes leverage. Most manipulation depends on provoking a predictable reaction: anger, defensiveness, anxiety, over-explaining. When you interrupt that pattern, you disrupt the dynamic. This is deeply Stoic. Epictetus taught that it is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. The insult is external, the interpretation is internal. If you decide that every challenge to your ego requires immediate correction, you will live in constant agitation. But if you train yourself to ask, "Does this require my energy?" before responding, you regain authorship. Controlled reaction does not mean passivity, it means selectivity. You choose when to engage, you choose how much energy to invest, you choose whether a moment deserves escalation or dismissal, and that choice is visible. People feel when someone is difficult to destabilize. They sense it in the pacing of their speech, in the steadiness of their posture, in the lack of urgency in their tone. Urgency signals fear. Calm signals strength. Here is the practical discipline. The next time you feel provoked, do nothing for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of silence. 3 seconds of breathing. 3 seconds of refusing to be dragged into someone else's emotional tempo. It will feel unnatural at first. Your body will want to respond immediately. That impulse is habit, not necessity. Break it. Over time, that micro-delay becomes your default. And when it does, something subtle shifts in how people treat you. They begin to realize that you are not easily triggered, and people are careful around what they cannot easily control. This first move alone will change your social gravity, because respect begins where reactivity ends. The second silent move is strategic absence. Most people destroy their own value by being constantly available. They respond instantly, agree immediately, show up every time, explain themselves to everyone, and make their presence predictable. Predictability feels safe, but it does not command respect. Scarcity does. When you are always accessible, your attention feels inexpensive. When you are always present, your presence feels ordinary. And when your time feels ordinary, your status lowers quietly without anyone announcing it. Strategic absence is not playing games. It is understanding human psychology. People assign value to what is not guaranteed. They lean toward what is not constantly offered. When you are selective with your energy, you signal that it is not unlimited, and anything limited becomes more carefully handled. Think about how most people react when they feel ignored. They increase effort. They send another message. They overcompensate. They try harder to reinsert themselves into the interaction. That urgency communicates dependence, and dependence weakens perception. Silent authority does the opposite. If someone delays responding, you do not chase. If someone withdraws slightly, you do not panic. If someone becomes distant, you do not immediately attempt to repair what may not be broken. You maintain your rhythm. You continue your routine. You stay grounded in your own direction. That steadiness communicates something powerful. Your life does not revolve around external validation. In professional settings, this principle is even clearer. The person who is always available for every request becomes expected. The person who protects their time becomes respected. When you do not immediately respond to every non-urgent message, when you do not accept every invitation, when you do not volunteer for every responsibility, you begin to recalibrate how others measure your availability. You are teaching people how to treat your time. If you treat it as disposable, they will too. If you treat it as guarded, they adjust. The Stoics practiced this internally long before it became a social tactic. They withdrew from emotional entanglement with what they could not control. They did not chase every opinion. They did not respond to every provocation. They conserved energy for what aligned with virtue and purpose. Strategic absence is simply that discipline applied socially. It is the refusal to overextend yourself just to feel included. There is a subtle confidence in someone who does not need to be everywhere, someone who can leave a conversation first, someone who can end a meeting without over-explaining, someone who can step back without broadcasting the reason. That quiet withdrawal signals independence, and independence attracts respect because it cannot be pressured easily. Here is how you practice it. Stop replying instantly unless it is necessary. Stop explaining every delay. Stop filling every silence. Stop attending spaces where your presence is tolerated rather than valued. You do not need to announce your withdrawal. You simply adjust your availability. Over time, people notice the difference. They become more intentional when reaching out. They become more careful with your time. Not because you demanded it, but because you demonstrated that your energy is not automatically granted. Strategic absence is not about isolation. It is about calibration. You remain present where it matters and absent where it does not. And that selectivity builds gravity. Because the person who can walk away calmly is always perceived as stronger than the one who clings. Respect grows in the space where neediness used to live. The third silent move is the one most people will never master because it attacks the ego directly. Refuse to defend yourself unnecessarily. The instinct to justify is one of the strongest impulses in human behavior. The moment someone misunderstands you, questions your decision, or criticizes your character, your nervous system demands correction. You want to explain. You want to clarify. You want to restore the image of yourself in their mind. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The more you rush to defend your image, the more you signal that your identity depends on their approval. And dependence lowers status instantly. Not every accusation deserves a response. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every opinion about you needs to be dismantled. When you over-defend, you shrink, because defense implies threat. And if you treat every comment as a threat, you reveal insecurity. Silent authority understands something deeper. People who are secure in their character do not feel compelled to litigate every narrative. If someone believes something inaccurate about you, ask yourself one question before speaking. Does this materially affect my life, my work, or my integrity? If the answer is no, silence is strength. Let them hold their version. Let them sit with their projection. When you do not scramble to correct them, you disrupt the power dynamic. They were expecting emotional energy. They were expecting tension. They were expecting you to prove something. Instead, they receive composure. That composure is unsettling to insecure people because it removes their leverage. Consider a scenario where someone says, "You've changed," and the tone implies criticism. Most people immediately respond with explanation. "No, I just have been busy. I didn't mean to seem distant. I've had a lot going on." In trying to soften the discomfort, they dilute their boundaries. Now imagine something different. You hear the comment. You pause. You respond calmly, "I have," and you let the sentence end there. No apology, no elaboration, no defensive tone. That brevity communicates confidence. It says you are comfortable with your evolution and do not need permission for it. Another example, someone accuses you of being cold because you stopped overgiving. The instinct is to justify your reasons, to list your sacrifices, to explain your fatigue. But over-explaining turns you into the defendant in a trial no one had authority to convene. Instead, you can say, "I've adjusted my priorities," and allow the silence to stand. That silence forces the other person to confront their own expectations rather than hiding behind your explanations. Epictetus warned against being disturbed by what others say about you. He reminded his students that if someone criticizes you for something untrue, you can laugh. If it is true, you can correct yourself. Neither requires emotional collapse. The Stoic position is radical because it assumes that your character is not on display for constant public review. When you know who you are, you do not panic when someone misreads you. Refusing to defend yourself unnecessarily does not mean tolerating injustice. If something directly harms your reputation in a meaningful way, you address it calmly and concisely. But the majority of daily criticisms are ego-level discomforts, not real threats. And ego-level discomfort does not deserve full-scale defense. The person who does not justify excessively appears grounded. The person who does not argue every perception appears secure. The person who can let a minor misunderstanding exist without anxiety appears powerful. Why? Because they demonstrate that their identity is internally sourced. People respect what does not wobble under scrutiny. They test less when they see that testing yields no emotional reaction. They provoke less when they see that provocation returns calm. And that is the escalation point. When you stop defending your ego, you stop giving others access to it. Over time, your silence becomes its own answer. Not cold, not arrogant, just steady. And steadiness commands respect more effectively than any speech ever could. The fourth silent move is physical stillness and deliberate presence. Before you speak, before you respond, before you even decide how to engage, your body has already communicated something about you. Most people underestimate how much status is transmitted non-verbally. They fidget when uncomfortable. They shift their weight when challenged. They laugh nervously when tension rises. They look away too quickly. They fill empty space with movement because silence feels threatening. But movement under pressure often signals instability. Stillness, on the other hand, signals control. When someone tries to interrupt you and you do not rush to compete for volume, when someone questions you and you hold steady eye contact instead of glancing down, when tension enters a conversation and your posture remains grounded, communicate authority without a single word. In social dynamics, the person who appears most comfortable in silence often holds the most power, because silence makes insecure people anxious, and whoever is less anxious controls the tempo. Think about the last time you watched two people disagree. One speaks quickly, gestures rapidly, leans forward aggressively. The other remains composed, measured shoulders, relaxed, voice steady. Even if you disagree with the second person, you instinctively perceive them as stronger. Why? Because their nervous system is not hijacked. Their body is not reacting impulsively. They are choosing their pace. That choice radiates stability. The Stoics trained this internally long before it became body language advice. They practiced observing their impressions without immediately acting on them. That inner pause eventually expresses itself physically. When your mind is not racing to defend itself, your body does not need to compensate. When you are not desperate to be heard, your voice does not need to compete. When you are not threatened by disagreement, your posture does not collapse. Here is how you practice this move. When someone challenges you, slow your breathing intentionally. Let there be a small gap before you respond. Keep your chin level. Do not over-nod to signal agreement prematurely. Do not rush to smile to reduce tension. Neutral composure is powerful. It communicates that you are not intimidated by discomfort, and discomfort is where most people lose authority. Eye contact is especially important. Not aggressive staring, not dominance theatrics, just steady presence. Hold it long enough to show you are not avoiding the moment. Then speak calmly if speaking is necessary. When you combine stillness with brevity, people feel the weight of your words more than their volume. This is not about intimidation. It is about internal regulation expressed externally. Someone who cannot regulate their body under pressure appears unpredictable. Someone who remains physically grounded appears reliable. And reliability builds trust. Trust builds respect. You will notice something subtle when you begin practicing this. Conversations slow down around you. People interrupt you less. People think twice before escalating tone, not because you demanded it, but because your presence resets the energy. Chaotic personalities feed off reaction. When your body does not react, their intensity often fades. Your calm becomes a mirror they cannot destabilize. Over time, stillness becomes natural. You will not have to remember to control your posture, because it will reflect the control you have cultivated internally. And when your internal and external signals align, people sense authenticity. Authentic strength does not need dramatics. It is quiet, stable, and difficult to shake. That is what commands respect without speaking. The fifth silent move is withdrawing emotional access. Not becoming cold, not becoming distant for drama, but becoming selective about who gets to experience your inner world. Most people lose respect because they overexpose themselves too quickly. They share frustrations with people who have not earned trust. They reveal insecurities to those who later weaponize them. They explain their fears, their plans, their doubts, hoping vulnerability will create connection. Sometimes it does. Often it creates leverage. Emotional transparency without discernment is not strength. It is unguarded exposure. And exposure in the wrong environment lowers perceived value. There is a difference between authenticity and accessibility. Authenticity means you are real. Accessibility means everyone gets full access to your emotional state. Silent authority understands that not everyone deserves backstage access to your mind. When you limit emotional access, you create boundaries without speeches. You stop narrating every internal struggle. You stop announcing every frustration. You stop reacting publicly to private battles. That restraint builds mystery, and mystery builds respect. Because when people cannot easily predict your emotional landscape, they approach you more carefully. Think about how often people overshare to feel understood. They vent immediately. They explain every reason behind their mood. They seek reassurance constantly. The more reassurance they need, the more dependent they appear. Dependency weakens authority. When you withdraw emotional overexposure, something changes. You speak less about your doubts. You handle problems privately first. You process emotions before presenting them. When you do share, it is measured, intentional, and directed toward people who have demonstrated loyalty and maturity. That selectivity signals self-respect. It says, "My inner world is valuable." It is not open to public inspection. In professional settings, this move is even more critical. If you express every insecurity about a project to colleagues who are competing with you, you lower your perceived competence. If you react emotionally to criticism in visible ways, you invite further pressure. But when you absorb feedback, calmly respond thoughtfully, and keep your deeper processing internal, you appear composed. Composure is interpreted as strength, and strength commands respect. The Stoics practiced this discipline relentlessly. They examined their emotions privately before acting publicly. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, not to the crowd. He processed fear, anger, and doubt in solitude, so that when he stepped into leadership, he did not leak instability into the empire. That is the model. You do not suppress emotion. You steward it. You do not deny pain. You manage where it is expressed. When someone attempts to provoke you into revealing insecurity, silence can be more powerful than confession. When someone tries to extract personal details to gain advantage, brevity protects you. When someone tests your boundaries by prying, a calm redirection preserves authority. Over time, people realize that they cannot easily access your vulnerabilities. They must earn trust, and what must be earned is treated with more care. This is not about building walls. It is about building doors that open selectively. The person who shares everything with everyone loses leverage. The person who shares wisely maintains gravity. Respect grows around those who are emotionally stable, measured, and not easily exposed. Withdraw emotional access from those who have not proven themselves trustworthy, and you will feel the shift immediately. You will feel lighter, less entangled, more centered. And that centeredness radiates outward. People sense when your inner life is not up for casual consumption. They adjust accordingly. Now step back and look at what these 5 silent moves actually build. Controlled reaction, strategic absence, refusing unnecessary defense, physical stillness, withdrawing emotional overexposure. None of them require aggression. None of them require intimidation. None of them require you to raise your voice or prove your worth. They all require one thing instead: inner governance. And that is the point most people miss. Respect is not a tactic. It is a byproduct of character. You cannot fake calm under pressure forever. You cannot perform detachment while secretly desperate for approval. You cannot imitate stillness while internally chaotic. Eventually, performance cracks. But discipline does not. The Stoics were not teaching tricks to win social games. They were teaching sovereignty, the ability to rule yourself so thoroughly that external noise loses its power to disturb you. When you govern your reactions, you remove leverage. When you govern your availability, you create value. When you govern your ego, you eliminate unnecessary conflict. When you govern your body, you project steadiness. When you govern your emotional access, you protect your dignity. And dignity is what people respond to. Think about the most respected person you know. Not the loudest, not the richest, not the most dramatic. The one who seems anchored, the one who does not chase arguments, the one who does not crumble under criticism, the one who speaks less but carries weight. That presence is not accidental. It is trained. It is the result of repeated choices to pause instead of react, to withdraw instead of cling, to remain composed instead of perform. In a world that rewards immediacy, the person who masters delay feels powerful. In a world addicted to exposure, the person who protects their inner life feels rare. In a world obsessed with validation, the person who does not seek it feels unshakable. That is why silent authority commands respect without demanding it, because it does not need to be seen trying. And here is the final shift you must internalize. The goal was never to make people fear you. The goal was never to make people regret crossing you. The goal was to become so internally stable that disrespect loses its effect. When disrespect loses its effect, it loses its incentive. People push where there is movement. They test where there is reaction. They challenge where there is insecurity. Remove those entry points, and the dynamic changes naturally. You stop living defensively. You stop preparing speeches in your head. You stop rehearsing arguments that may never happen. You move through rooms calmly, speak deliberately, and leave without over-explaining your departure. That kind of energy is self-contained, and self-contained energy commands space. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself that the true measure of a man is how he responds when things do not go his way, not how loudly he asserts himself when they do. That is the difference between ego and authority. Ego needs recognition. Authority needs alignment. If you practice these silent moves consistently, you will notice something subtle but undeniable. People interrupt you less. They choose their words more carefully around you. They test you less frequently, not because you threatened them, but because you demonstrated that you are not easily moved. And people respect what they cannot easily move. Remember this, above everything else, respect is not taken, it is radiated. It radiates from a mind that is not chaotic, from emotions that are not uncontrolled, from a presence that is not desperate for attention. Govern yourself first. Let others adjust. If this message resonated with you, commit to one thing: not changing others, not controlling outcomes. Commit to mastering your own responses this week, because when your inner world becomes steady, your outer world recalibrates around it. And that is power that does not need to announce itself.